Welcome to the Judgment Call podcast, a podcast where I bring together some of the most curious minds on the planet. Risk takers, adventurers, travelers, investors, entrepreneurs, and simply mind-bogglers. To find all episodes of this show, simply go to Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, or go to our website, judgmentcallpodcast.com. If you like this show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or subscribe to us on YouTube. This episode of the Judgment Call podcast is sponsored by Mighty Travels Premium. Full disclosure, this is my business. What we do at Mighty Travels Premium is to find the airfare deals that you really want. Thousands of subscribers have saved up to 95% on their airfare. Those include $150 round-trip tickets to Hawaii from many cities in the US, or $600 lie-flat tickets in business class from the US to Asia, or $100 business class lie-flat tickets from Africa round-trip all the way to Asia. In case you didn't know, about half the world is open for business again and accepts travelers. Most of those countries are in South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. To try out Mighty Travels Premium, go to mightytravels.com/MTP, or if that's too many letters for you, simply go to MTP, the number 4, and the letter U.com to sign up for your 30-day free trial. We talked about what you do a little bit before, but obviously I'm still in the dark to a wide extent. Help me understand a little better how you got into extreme travel in the first place. How did your own travel story start?
Without wanting to take a sort of tangential view already, I'm not always desperately comfortable about the term extreme travel, to say this is what, this is James Willcox, this is Untamed Borders, this is extreme travel. So just in general, because what we try and do, as well as guide people and organize logistics in countries, is to try and show them in a much more nuanced way, to try and give people a kind of a bigger experience of the countries they're in, a cultural experience. The geography, the geopolitics is certainly one part of that. But to then sort of pigeonhole that as extreme and being like, well, that's the reason why anyone's going to go to Afghanistan or Somalia or Ethiopia or anywhere we guide, it doesn't sit that well with us. I mean, if someone wants to call it extreme tourism, that's fine. It's not a big deal. I'm not so caught up on it. But it's not a term that I particularly like. But if you want to say, how did I get into like setting up a company that started off guiding in Pakistan and Afghanistan? Absolutely. I'm happy to.
I wouldn't use or think of it as in any way as a negative thing. I think it's very courageous what you guys do, and it's very spectacular that you are able to put the spotlight on regions that are much safer and undiscovered to the traveler. And I know you've done this through Untamed Borders, the travel agency that you started, but you also have done this probably before, and that's what I wanted to get at. So I know not all of your travels are probably extreme, but I see extreme as extremely interesting, not in any way negative.
Absolutely, and I think that's the thing. And I guess what I always fear is by putting sort of labels on things is that you feed into the narrative of the only thing about the countries that we work in is that there's a risk, and then you get the idea of extreme. But how I began with Untamed Borders, like you, as you said correctly, like I always loved to travel. I mean, in my 20s, I worked in different jobs in the UK, in London, and I saved up some money, and then I'd go traveling either in the Middle East for a while and then come back, or in East Asia. I mean, the kind of things that lots of people do. Lots of people who are younger do that kind of thing. I don't know why. I mean, part of it is you don't want to do a normal job. You want to get away from it. Part of it is to see parts of the world, get different experiences, meet other people, like-minded people. It was great. And in 2007, I was on a trip through the Middle East and Central Asia, and I met two guys, one from Pakistan and one from Afghanistan. And they both primarily worked with professional people, so with researchers, with documentary makers, with journalists, with photographers, but sometimes with tourists as well, just people interested in the region. And they wanted to work more with tourists. They in the same way that I was talking about extreme travel before, they wanted to kind of do less of this kind of showing the bad side of the countries they were in. They wanted to show the positive areas and the beauty and the interesting things. And I like that idea. And we talked about the three of us starting a company together, and I didn't really think there was a place for me in it. But what I did say is I would, work with them. I built a website. It was the beginning, 2007 was when social media was just kind of getting big. Everyone was starting to get their Facebook pages, 2006, 2007. So suddenly these two guys and a guy from the UK who, if they didn't, suddenly you could have a travel company with a Facebook page which had the same reach as any other company in the world. And so after 6 months of a year, we managed to get, we started guiding people. People were interested. We managed to run some trips. And I was like, actually, this is what I want to do. This is an amazing opportunity for me. And we restructured it, registered it in the UK in 2008. And that's how we began in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And now, it's COVID, but we have worked in between 25 and 30 countries across the Middle East, Russia, former Soviet Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Central Africa. So it's just expanded, partly due to the interest of the people that we guide, and partly due to once you start working in regions that are quite interesting and less touristed, I meet people in the development world, in the conflict media world, in all sorts of areas where I can get contacts and find information and be able to operate in other areas. So that's in a nutshell is how Untamed Borders began.
Yeah, I've been watching you guys for a couple of years, and I think it's a fantastic story that you guys have created and what you've built. And this podcast is about risk takers, and the idea is to get a sense of how people perceive risk and how they deal with it and how they come out on the other side. And hopefully they don't just learn from it, but that's obviously the most important part. They also create something interesting and sustainable in the process. And I've always been mesmerized by the description of your trips. And you mentioned the countries that are very difficult to access. I have never been to, and I've been to 130 countries, but I've definitely shied away from going to Iran by myself, Afghanistan. I want to go to Pakistan, actually, so I want to dive into this. And I've been to Ethiopia, but I haven't obviously been to Somaliland or Somalia. So there's a bunch of countries that I think everyone who travels a lot is very curious about. And we hear these war stories, and they might be made up. But there's always someone who flies into Somalia, who flies into Mogadishu, and kind of it gives us a report of basically guns and steel and tanks, and he barely made it out, or she. That's kind of what you see and what's being portrayed, even on the popular travel blogs and obviously also in travel media. When I know your agency organizes trips, and I just checked your website again. That's a lot of countries you guide tours to. Are you still active in going to these countries? And which countries have you visited over the years?
There's a fair few questions within there. So let me talk about. Yeah, I'm still involved in.
I'll let you choose. Yes.
Yeah, I'm still involved in working in and guiding in some of the countries. Now, from what you see on the website, just to give an idea of what we do as a company, I'd still say 20% of what we organize is professional work. So sometimes for documentary makers, for researchers, for photographers, etc., etc. For the rest, broadly speaking, it's tourism. And we have a bunch of group trips that we have each year to the kind of popular places that we go, that it's worth getting a group of 6, 8, 10 people together to guide. And they will have usually an international guide. So a guide from Europe or North America accompanying them. And I used to, at the beginning, guide all of those kind of trips, but now it's pretty rare that I guide them. So I would generally go, I'd be out of the country if it's a specific project that we're working on. So one of the things that I help organise is a race in Afghanistan, the Marathon of Afghanistan. It's the only mixed gender international sporting event in the country. And I go out for that group because we have a big group of people that run it. And also I help organise the race. So it's important for me to be there. I also occasionally, if it's a media, if it's a production, that, you know, they need some sort of specialist assistance, I might go out for that as well. But it's fairly rare that I guide a sort of general group. We have other people that that do that. And as far as the countries that we guide in, I think the majority of the countries that we guide in, I've visited. So I mean, it's a passion for me. It's interesting. I've got lots of friends in these countries. So when I go back, it's not just guiding a trip, but it's also catching up with people. I'd spend some days before, some days after, just checking out the operations that we've got and how things work. So yeah, I love to travel. And generally, I'm away from Europe in the places that we work maybe 2 to 3 months of the year. Pre-COVID, that was the normal kind of thing. So maybe 2 to 3 months is perfect for me. It allows me to run the business, have the life I've got in Europe, but also I get to travel, work, and enjoy those areas. You specifically kind of asked about sort of Mogadishu and I guess the stereotypical travel blog, which is, or vlog or whatever, or someone who's an influencer and has a following and they go to Mogadishu. And I think it's a bit what I was talking to before. A lot of travel feeds into, if you're not careful, it has this sort of self-perpetuating myth about it. Wherever you go, if you want to go to, I don't know what a US equivalent is, you go to New York and you're like, what am I going to do in New York? So you see, I don't know, eating a hot dog or eating oysters at Grand Central Station or going to this or going to that. So you do that, you take pictures of it and everyone else sees the pictures and you kind of do the same thing. And that's the story of New York. And that's kind of what you go to. New York's probably a bad idea because people have a lot more information about what they can do. But most people don't know that much about Mogadishu. And you're kind of limited to what you can do. And people need clicks on their blog, and it's famous for being dangerous. And so having a close call in Mogadishu seems like a good thing for a blog. So for sure, we've guided people whose depiction of their trip is different to how we would have perceived it. Certainly was suggesting the risk is higher. But on the flip side, there is risk. There is risk. And if you're in a city where there is a bomb whilst you're there, you could easily describe that as a close call. I mean, if you're in a city in North America or in Europe and there was a building burnt down on the day you were there, you wouldn't necessarily call that a close call. But if it's a bomb, you kind of consider it a close call. So the idea of risk and sort of perception of risk and perception of having a close call, I guess, is something that I guess, yeah, as you were saying, it's risk is sometimes, and whether something was close and whether they were lucky is a little bit in the eye of the beholder.
I think you're absolutely right with the observation you just made, is that these myths about this particular place, they become part of what people perceive about a certain place. And in San Francisco, where I live, there was this story where it was a true story. We have a couple of really dangerous areas here, and an Australian couple was assaulted, and it went viral in Australia, and people realized how dangerous it is or can be in San Francisco, which is absolutely true. A lot of American cities have some really bad areas. We should never go. Definitely not at night, and definitely not alone, or even as a couple. And you're almost guaranteed going to get mugged. And that's easy to not be aware of in a city like San Francisco that's so dense. Like a couple of blocks it's fine, and then a couple of blocks later it's extremely dangerous. And I spent quite some time in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and it isn't a dangerous town during the day, but it gets quite hairy during the night, and it's almost guaranteed, local or not, that you're going to get mugged if you run around downtown without a car. But if you just jump over to Zanzibar, for instance, this problem doesn't exist. And there is really local pockets where people feel like they can target. There's a lot of targets for them, and the same is true for like in Lagos, right? And you have parts of Lagos that seem, at least judging from local crime, pretty easy. And I walked around Victoria Island at night, and I never had any issues. But a lot of locals have a ton of issues that they have been robbed, been carjacked, just on the mainland, which is less than 5 miles away. So it's extremely localized, right? And that's obviously very, very difficult to make that judgment from a country afar or from a continent afar. So it really is something that travelers have to ease into, and that takes time, right? So you have to arrive there, you have to ask locals, you have to make, you have to have the own your own ability to judge a particular risk, to judge a neighborhood without having all the data, right? Because you never have enough data. Only the locals have all the data, and even they might have trouble seeing changes in the environment. And I think this is generally a problem with the travel. When you think of it, a lot of tourism, and that every country is slightly different, but let's take Morocco as an example. I always felt Morocco and a lot of people in Morocco just specialize in misleading new arrivals. Like, tourists don't know anything, right? They overpay for taxis, they overpay for souvenirs. There's a whole industry that usually sprouts up, and not every country is as guilty of that. And obviously, 99% of the population is not involved in this. This is a small percentage of the population wherever we look, and they kind of take advantage of this information arbitrage, right? They have way more information. They know the local prices. They know everything about the local setup, and they mislead the newcomers, so to speak. It's a bit like in a prison, right? So the newcomers probably don't have it the most comfortable, but the people who've been in prison for 10 years, they've established themselves. And I think the same is true for tourism. So there is this information arbitrage, and the internet has helped, but it's only partially solving this, and because there's just so much information, there's so much granularity. And I think you guys see this with security, but everyone who travels a lot sees this just by arriving at the airport, right? It's sometimes 10 times as expensive to get a taxi than when a local gets a taxi. And that's something people are worried about, right? That really definitely increases their anxiety before they go to a new place in the same country or in a different country.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I've always tried to look at, because I see it as well. I mean, you use Morocco as an example, but there are places all over the world where you've got, there's a kind of product for sale, whether it's a tour to somewhere or handicrafts or this or whatever. And there's money to be made, and there's commission to be made, and there's helping people into shops, or the free tour to whatever, and you get taken to a rug factory, or all of those kind of things. And part of that, I've always looked at it from the other angle. I mean, yes, you can look at it from the tourist angle. You're coming in, and there's this information disparity, and that's where the money is being made. But you see it from a local shopkeeper's angle. You've got a cruise. I mean, a cruise boat is the classic example. The cruise boat comes in, people, they're just trucked straight into a city or a town and have no idea what the price is, no idea really what the money is, probably have US dollars anyway, or euros, don't even have the local currency, don't really know what anything costs. And people are selling things. Now, if there's 4 of you selling the same thing, and one of them, there's almost, the temptation is too much to not take advantage of that situation. It's not that people are necessarily ripping off, but if someone's willing to pay something, and the shorter period of time someone has in a town, so if a cruise boat is stopping for the day, the harder the sell has to be, because you've got these guys, you've got someone there for like a minute to try to sell them something. You've got another town where people stay for like 3, 4, 5 days. It's a much easier sell. No one's necessarily buying something the first day. There's more of an interaction. There's more of a tale. So how, I've seen this in different places, how tourists visit a town or a place, how much time they spend there. You go to Egypt and if people are chucked off a tour bus and there's a 50-meter walk between the tour bus and the site, and it's lined with people selling stuff, they've got 3 seconds to try and attract someone's information. So it's all about a hugely hard, fast sell. Whereas you've got somewhere else where people are spending a week, it can be a soft sell. You meet someone on day 1 and you can sell something to them on day 3. So I think, I know this is getting a little bit off the track, but there's also, I work a lot with, people in lots of countries. There's a perspective of the country that's being touristed as well. It's not just about people trying to rip people off. It's about doing business in the situation that you've found yourself in, I guess.
Oh, I totally understand the individual who tries to make money, and I think that I'm not judging this in a negative way necessarily. Um, what you have to keep in mind too is it increases the anxiety on the other end, right? So, say if you have people swarming into a bus and you can't literally. I was at Taj Mahal 20 years ago. You couldn't even leave the bus because people were just pushing into the bus because they wanted to see what they have to offer. It seemed like a dangerous situation if you didn't know it was going on because suddenly hundreds of people stormed into an already cramped bus. It wasn't dangerous, but I didn't know that in that moment, right? I didn't know they just wanted to sell me something. I thought I was going to get crushed to death, which didn't happen, but could have easily happened, I felt. So what I think it increases the anxiety of people of taking that adventure, and maybe, and we see this with COVID now, right? So people have this crazy anxiety and have taken it on a notch higher, right? So COVID, many countries in the world have no COVID restrictions, but they still have lost 90%, or at least no entry restrictions, right? They've still lost 90 or 80% of their business. So tourists are not going there. They might be worried about the flights, and there is, certain age groups obviously have a higher risk than others. But there is a level of anxiety that you create. And obviously the individual can't control this, right? For the individual, it's a rat race. If I don't make a sale, someone else is going to make that sale, right? So, but it is making it harder to attract a wider audience. And as we always feel like, I don't actually know if that's true, but I always have that impression. Again, maybe not a good thing, because a lot of tourists show shitty behavior, 100% true. But if you see the development cycle, it seems like more developed countries are in a position to attract more people, just because they have better infrastructure, there's less anxiety, there's no safety concerns. It seems it helps everyone, and it's a bit like, like a religion. It seems counterintuitive in the first place, that you regulate yourself, that you kind of look for a higher being, right? But it seems like if everyone joins in, or a critical mass joins in, then you create a better future. And obviously it's a high risk, right? So if something is wrong in that religious idea, then you're all in trouble, and not just the individual. So I do see the incentives on the ground. They're quite tricky, but I always felt. What do you think is this inflection point where suddenly a country moves away from this? Okay, let's make a quick sale, right? Like Egypt, so to speak. It moves into, it has high barriers of entries. A lot of countries in Africa are very tricky to get in. Lots of paperwork. Like Nigeria, you fill paperwork for weeks. And then they go to this inflection point and say, okay, now we feel like we want to change this. So it should be easier. We want to have a certain kind of groups of people that we want here. Safety has gone up. Do you think that's a conscious decision, or it happens and some of these countries just advance a little bit?
But before I answer that, because it's both is the answer. But you're talking about the anxiety. I guess the anxiety when you go somewhere is there's a lot of unknown. So there's an unknown because you go somewhere, there's no fixed price. There's no you're going to go out to eat. Maybe you are vegetarian or vegan. You don't know whether you're going to get that food. You've got specific dietary requirements. All of this stuff is like this kind of unknown. And as soon as you take away, because this is the thing, tourism, when you become, as sort of mass tourism begins, you take away a lot of that anxiety because you want to attract more people. But taking away that anxiety also takes away sometimes the essence of what is actually happening in that country. So rather than in going to a traditional chaikhana in Afghanistan, where you've got like 3 options, kebabs, palau and soup, which all have meat in them, you end up finding a tourist restaurant kind of comes up that has lots of different options and vegetarian options and seats rather than sitting on the floor and all of this kind of stuff, and proper toilets and all of that kind of stuff. And you don't have the same people who would go into that restaurant. You don't have the traders and all of these kind of people, because you've created a tourist restaurant rather than a traditional chaikhana. So as soon, and again, you end up with a tourist shop with fixed prices on goods rather than you're haggling for stuff. And you create something that is not actually of the place you're visiting. you end up having a slightly diluted experience. And I think that's one of the things that Untamed Borders always looks for, because we work in a lot of places without a huge amount of tourism. Most of the places our guests visit, they don't see it through this prism of tourism. They go to Afghanistan, you see Afghanistan, like no one's, apart from us or a couple of guys, doing anything to try and change things to make it easier for tourists. Everyone's just living their life. So you get that authenticity is a strange word within tourism, but you get something that is more authentic. And then going on to what you were saying about, I mean, the classic example of a country that has decided to sort of set a level of tourism is Bhutan, isn't it? You pay this $250 a day in Bhutan. That's basically what you pay. It's very hard to pay any more than that. That's your kind of pay, and you can do what you want there. Like it's to keep out the kind of the riffraff. It's to have it so that it's kind of like exclusive. Somewhere like Nigeria or Equatorial Guinea or Saudi until recently, extremely hard to get into, but that's due to geopolitical reasons rather than trying to control tourism, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a convergence, and at least pre-COVID, that people wanted to discover tourism and wanted to open up to as much tourism as possible. I feel there's a good reason why Thailand, for instance, doesn't really reopen, or that they've taken so much time to reopen. One would be the viral part, but the other part is I'm amazed that the population was able to how do I say that, be okay with the amount of tourism that they actually received, and that is a mental challenge and a mental toll. I'm sure it has taken on a lot of people in Thailand. And only a small percentage actually makes money off tourism, and there's a bigger mental challenge that's where the whole population is exposed to. I want to dive a little bit more into specific countries, and because the countries that you've been to, it's a pretty exclusive view that you've got. When you think of Afghanistan, a place that we know only from, say, war movies and SEAL Team episodes. How do you describe Afghanistan? What's dear to your heart in Afghanistan? How is the city or the cities like? How's that mix between people who live in the rural areas and in those cities?
I mean, yeah. My view of Afghanistan is different from, for a dozen years traveling to Afghanistan 2 or 3 times a year and organizing tourism and events and generally positive things. I mean, I always see, the first time I traveled through Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, I mean, they're different countries, but there's a certain link in that there's a lot of conservatism in the countries, but people are very open about themselves, about talking about the country that they're in, their own country, geopolitics. Iran slightly less about geopolitics, but certainly sort of Afghanistan and Pakistan, people love talking about how things are going, their perspectives on things. There is incredible scenery. You've got the Hindu Kush mountains in Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan, just the rural scenes I just love, especially coming from, I guess, somewhere like the UK, which is quite a green place. So you've got Afghanistan, there's these 2 extremes. Most of the country is quite barren. It's not completely barren, but it's, you can graze some sheep and goats on it, but that's about it. But there's these huge rivers run through the country. The irrigation channels run off those. So you have these swathes of green within them. So it's either dusty and hard, extremely inhospitable, or when you get into the irrigated areas, it's shady and cool and there's great fruit and all of this kind of stuff. And it's very typical of Afghanistan, these contrasts. It's very hard on one side, and on the other side, extremely hospitable and really pleasant and kind of like a paradise on the other side. And I think it's these 2 things kind of run through the country and a little bit of the psyche. And I mean, for people that like, historical places, Herat is an amazing city on the near the Iranian border. The center was sort of built in maybe 500 years ago, so it has all this sort of amazing sort of blue tiled timbered architecture, and just it's constantly changing. I mean, any post-conflict country has a huge buzz about it. Like, you have an idea and you go for it. Stuff is happening all the time. Like, restaurants pop up, ideas pop up. Someone just comes in 5 years ago with like some panini machines they buy in Italy, and suddenly it's like a huge thing, and everyone's like, just new stuff comes all the time. I mean, when in London or New York did someone bring in something new that everybody was like, this is amazing? It just doesn't happen. Whereas in Kabul or Mogadishu, new ideas, it's this kind of incredibly entrepreneurial atmosphere as well, which just gives a huge amount of energy. And I think people don't see that. Also don't see that necessarily in their own country, because they know they're being held back by the violence and by other sort of political instability. And a lot of international people don't see that, because they also just are there. People in Kabul or Mogadishu are there because there's lots of problems. They're working there. Whereas I come in and I do see these kind of opportunities and entrepreneurialism and energy, which I think is often overlooked.
I was just checking my connection. Yes, that would have been my next question, is how entrepreneurial these countries are, because that would have been my expectation, that entrepreneurship is something that is maybe broken or is just blossoming, and the most conflict that breaks entrepreneurship, and then hopefully it comes back. And it's something I'm myself, being an entrepreneur, I'm really excited to see places that are that entrepreneurial. I feel they generate a community relatively easily, and they definitely warm my heart if I find a country that's really entrepreneurial. And I felt a lot of countries in Asia, at least at the surface, seem to be very entrepreneurial. That maybe isn't as much true anymore. There's definitely maybe just gotten richer, or the opportunities have run out a little. When you go through Afghanistan, and or your particular tours go through Afghanistan, how much of a thought do you still have to give to security planning? Do you have to stop going out at night? Is it that easy? Or you just go on certain routes, or you have maybe a military patrol? I ended up in Lagos to have a police escort that I recruited for myself, that I felt was necessary when I left Victoria Island. How many efforts do you actually have to still do in Afghanistan?
I mean, yeah, look, we when we guide trips there are restrictions with our guests. So, I mean, we're constantly reviewing the kind of the security situation. I mean, we have our setup, we have our procedures put in place. I mean, when we're talking about risk before, everyone, with anything, you draw up an assessment of risk. It's likelihood multiplied by severity. So, trying to keep people, making sure people, trying to make sure people don't get sick, get sort of gastroenteritis, this kind of stuff. So, okay, it's quite likely, and it's not quite likely, but we guide 100 people there a year. Someone's going to get some sort of stomach bug. What can we do to reduce it? Okay, we tell people to wash hands, drink bottled water, etc., etc. And even if it does happen, the risk, the severity is not that bad, so it's fine. Whereas in Afghanistan, we were talking about, muggings in San Francisco and all of that kind of stuff. To be honest, the thing in somewhere like Afghanistan is there's not many near misses. It's not like, people go traveling in South America and come back with a story, they had their shoes robbed at knife point or gunpoint or something like that. You don't really get anything like that in Afghanistan. If something goes wrong, it's going to go really wrong. So we just have to spend a lot of time reducing that. So yeah, in most of the places we guide in Afghanistan, the group cannot leave, can't do anything outside of the guest house or hotel without us. I can go into it a little bit. I mean, we look at risk in two ways generally. So in Afghanistan, I mean, there's a risk of sort of pre-planned attacks, and there's opportunist attacks. So in something like Afghanistan, the risk of an opportunist attack is very small. So we're talking about muggings, we're talking about someone seeing the group and acting and things like that. It's almost non-existent. The risk is a pre-planned attack. So we put in a lot of effort to make sure that our company is very unlikely to be the target of a pre-planned attack by lots of methods, by having an extremely small footprint, changing how we work, changing how we have groups. We're lucky that we don't have anyone based full time in Afghanistan that's non-Afghan. So when people come in, nobody really knows. We keep it to a very small number of people. But there's the risk of us being in somewhere which could be an attack. So if we stay in the best hotel in Kabul, which is the Serena, that's where other high profile people stay. So we just avoid staying there. So we avoid the kind of places that are likely to be attacked. And because there is this risk in Kabul, we don't let our guests wander around by themselves because they don't know what people are saying. They don't know and they can get into all sorts of other trouble. If they start taking pictures of, military buildings or ministries or things like that, they can get arrested and all of that kind of stuff. So generally, we keep them on a fairly tight leash. But in somewhere like Afghanistan, there's a couple of areas, the Wakhan corridor in the far northeast and Bamiyan in the central. And for geopolitical reasons, basically they're rural areas where a minority ethnic and religious group live. There isn't any kind of Taliban, there isn't any Sunni extremism there. And therefore we give the guests a bit more freedom. That's where we do things like skiing and hiking and, the marathon race and things like that. So it depends on as you said, it depends on the region. And then we base our security risks on that, and then we implement certain procedures and we inform our guests. And with the guests, you can't give them too much information to begin with. People just don't take it in. So you give information before they arrive, you give some more at the briefing, and we guide with small groups. So if people are acting in a way that's putting the group at risk, we can have a quiet word with them and kind of give information as it goes on. So and this is constantly, updated. When there can be some huge attack in Kabul, which looks like, is that going to change how we work? And we're like, well, no, because we're kind of expecting huge attacks in Kabul. That's we're planning for that. And then there can be something that doesn't even make the news, doesn't even make the wire on a road that we might use. And we're like, okay, that's changing. We're going to fly there now. We're not going to drive there. Some small incident that can change how we work. So when we get news in, we speak to it. But as you said, like the team we have in Afghanistan, the team we have on the ground, they kind of know what we're doing. They understand what is going to change. And we also get information from other sources. So in Afghanistan, for example, there's an organization that provides security reports for international organizations. So we get reports from them. And that's a useful overview, but it's not as useful perhaps. It's good to work in side by side with the information we get from the drivers, from the guides, from sort of local people. So that's a bit of an overview about how we see security and kind of the things we have in place.
I'm subscribed to a couple of those country reports in terms of security, and I do read them before I go to a country. They help me certainly a little bit, but it's a country report, right? It has nothing to do with the city or the neighborhoods or the region you're in. So that's always the trouble I have with those. One thing that really worries me, and I've been to so many different countries, I've been in hairy situations, but one thing that still worries me is the opportunity to be singled out simply because you're a foreigner or you're perceived as an American or you're perceived as a Brit, right? Which is relatively easy to see by skin color. You ask people a couple of times, or there's people you talk to, you stay in a hotel where foreigners stay. Those things are relatively difficult to shake off, and I feel like for locals it's very easy to target this if they have those bad intentions, and very few people have those. Those are very few terrorist groups in terms of fortunately in terms of sheer manpower, but they are around, and that is something. Even I'm actually never really worried about random bombings, right? As terrible as they are, but if you're not specifically targeted, I felt the risk of actually being a victim of those is relatively low from my personal perspective, right? So others would make a different judgment. But in many countries, I feel like I'm literally the only person who looks like a foreigner. Let's put it this way: it looks like an American. And I feel like if someone wants to get at me, it's so easy. They don't have to look at my passport, right? So they just bring out the machete, and that's the end of it. There isn't much to do unless you go with an armed guard security, which I feel is a bit of a help. Maybe not against Al Qaeda, but if you have you obviously attract more attention, but on the upside, you do have guns, right? And you do have people who've been in these situations before, and you have bulletproof vests, and you have and maybe armored, but at least a vehicle that can make a quick escape. So I've been looking into these options. I was curious if you feel, if you go to this level of personal security, if it's worth it, would you still do a tour like this? And B, maybe you attract way more attention. Maybe in some, you actually make your own situation more complicated and more dangerous.
Absolutely. So so for us, generally, as a general rule, if we feel we're in a place where we need armed security, we generally are not going to guide there, because it puts there's various reasons. There's one, it makes things a lot more expensive. So there's a price kind of issue, and secondly, it puts a huge gap between you and the people of the country that you're visiting. I mean, if you were walking through Miami and there's a guy going down the street and he's got 4 armed guards creating a safe space for him to walk through, you don't feel like he's part of the community. He's completely separate from the community. So absolutely. It's not ideal. Sure. But we do use it. We do use armed security in Mogadishu, in Somalia, and in Puntland in Somalia. They're the only places that we generally use it. And the point you were saying about the having a 4 or 6 man armed security team, they are there predominantly to prevent an opportunist attack. They're to stop someone saying, look, we've got a couple of guys with guns, we're going to rob him, we're going to do this, we're going to take some of that. Now, you're right. If it's Daesh or the Taliban and they really want you, 6 guys is not going to do much. In fact, it might make things worse, because you might get in a firefight and things could be in a worse situation for you. Of course, having armed security attracts more attention. So the way we look at it, we look at the risk. If there's a major risk of an armed opportunist attack, and having armed security is going to minimize that, then having armed security is a good thing. If we don't see that as a major risk, and we don't see us as being a particularly high-profile pre-planned target, which is the case in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there's loads, especially in like Kabul, there's loads of great targets. There's loads of government, military, police, embassies, international people. And these are the places that are targeted. Daesh target the Shia communities. There's so many great targets out there. We feel the way that we work, we can come in and do our work and not be a major target, and be able to operate in the way that we do by working in a very low profile way. But something could change. I mean, that can change. The one thing with any assessment of risk is that we assess it on the data that we have. And that can change. Just because it didn't happen yesterday doesn't mean it can't happen tomorrow. So it's not a foolproof system, but we feel that in Afghanistan, there's 2 ways of working. That's a way that we work, or, get a couple of bulletproof cars, loads of guys armed with guns, drive around like that. That's also a really good system. But if we're going to be organizing the stuff that we do, we think that our system of working and the profile of the clients we have, the fact they're in the country for a short period of time, reduces risk to an acceptable level. So armed security work is good in situations, and it depends who you are as well. If you're you're working for World Bank in Kabul, I'd want to stay in a compound with loads of security because I'm going to be targeted.
I think that's a smart way, the way you're describing it. I think this is a way to deal with security. I felt for my personal use, I always felt it's the environment is so fluid and so changing. There is really no one solution. And as you said, in Afghanistan, there's places we don't even have to worry about that. And then 20 miles later, and you're on the wrong road, and there's an ID, and there was just an attack. The picture will completely change. Out of your experience with Untamed Borders, how many close call security incidents did you have? Stuff were either there was an immediate threat, or there was a bombing the day before, the bombing the day after, somewhere where you personally would feel, oh my gosh, we have to actually review the risk because it's bigger than we thought.
I mean, look, we've had groups in cities where there has been a bomb. I mean, we probably guide, I don't know, it's COVID now, but before COVID, we'd guide 100 people in Afghanistan a year. So, it's just the odds are that there'd be, Kabul's a city of 6 million people. There being a bomb in the city when we've got guests in the city is not an unusual, it's not a situation that's so unusual. We've changed and stopped working in countries and regions, on a regular basis. We used to guide through the central route of Afghanistan from Kabul to Herat, and it goes through past a place called the Minaret of Jan. It's this sort of single standing minaret that's 55 meters high. It's quite incredible. We used to guide there until 2009, and then without too much detail, in Gore province, one of the routes through, it was kind of government controlled, and then then it became Taliban controlled, or a guy that's aligned to the Taliban controlled it, and we stopped going there. So I mean, things happen on a fairly, not a regular basis, but things happen in the countries that we work in where we're just like, look, we can't guide in this area. We used to guide to more places in the north of Afghanistan, to these ethnically Turkmen towns of Akcha and Anhoy, and we don't guide there anymore. So things change. Generally, security starts to deteriorate, and we avoid it, and then it gets better, or it just gets worse, and we stop doing it. I mean, we used to drive between Kabul and Mazar-i-Sharif. We used to drive between Kabul and Bamiyan, and now we fly between the two because the security on the roads is not good enough. So things change, and we have to adapt. I mean, generally, the issues that we have with people is, the usual things after a dozen years of organizing these things. Road traffic accidents. People breaking limbs, falling over, trekking, or getting a tooth kicked out by a horse, or things like that. I mean, we've had guests, I guess, not. How can I put this? Yeah, there was, I think one time in Afghanistan, a compound was attacked that was maybe 300, 400 meters from where one of the guest houses we were using. So probably something like that is the closest that something has been. But ultimately, we've put in the procedures to mitigate the risk. And what I always say is, whenever we do that, how would I feel if something happened to this person? I had to, I've got my day in court. What did you do? Would I feel we reduced the risk to a reasonable amount? Yes, I did. This is what we did. These are the reasons behind it. But you can't predict anything. You can't completely eliminate risk. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, I guess from the other side, going to destinations that are more risky is something that appeals to a small minority of travelers, but they are extremely interested in it, right? So there's a reason we like skiing. There's a reason we like fast cars. So it's something in our blood, and I think this is a small percentage of the population where we feel like if there's no risk, then there's no fun. And that sounds silly, but to an extent is you have to push yourself to the borders of your own being, of your own comfort zone, in order to learn about yourself. And that naturally involves risk. If you're paragliding, that's really risky. We had Xavier de la Rue on. He basically jumps off helicopters off cliffs, sheer cliffs, and goes 180 degrees down, basically flies with the snowboard on. And that's a lot of risk, but he's very, very cautious in terms of how he plans these routes. but things can go wrong in 2 seconds, and he can go off the wrong cliff. And there's no rope. I mean, you only get one chance at these lines. That's what the particular you're a skier probably noticed the particular path that you go down a hill is called a line. If you miss it by a little bit, there's no second chance. That's it very often. So you've got to be very cautious on one side, but also extremely interested in risk on the other side. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity that you guys make it less dangerous or more accessible. And I think this is where you come in, right? I think this is something that wonderful that you opened this up and give people the ability to see a country quite different. But it brings me to your guests. I would think, and stereotype, you're going to be like, this is American stereotype. But I would think those are guys with the prior military training that have been in pretty hairy situations, and then they sign up because they feel like it's just going to be a little easier, maybe cheaper to go with you guys, but they're already really interested in risk. Is that true, or is it really the average traveler signs up with most of these tours that you do, especially to Afghanistan and Somalia?
Yeah, I mean, it's what you're saying is not the profile of the people that come with us at all. We have guided a few veterans, which has always been an amazing experience, to be honest, to guide people that had, served in Afghanistan and have gone back and seen a completely different side. I mean, there's been like half a dozen, I think, in the years. But I mean, some of that's been amazing. There was one guy, he had spent the best part of 3 years flying over Afghanistan, identifying targets to bomb. And he was a skier. He was a snowboarder, actually. And he would fly over these mountains in the winter, and he would promise himself every day that one day he'd go back to Afghanistan and snowboard these mountains. And he never really thought he would do it. And then he found us and was like, this is amazing, I'm going to do it. So to be able to bring somebody's kind of crazy dream alive is an amazing feeling. But the majority of the people are people that like to travel, and that's it. And you were saying, it's men and women as well. I think the group trips are usually 50% women. I mean, women, this is a big generalization, but the group trip, I think, partly because women are generally a bit more social, and also perhaps the idea of just, spending 10 days or 2 weeks with one, Pakistani or Afghan man guiding might not appeal as much as it might to a man. But I'd say the group trips are about 50% women, and generally people that have traveled a lot. That's what it is. It's enjoying travel, and usually at some stage in their life, I'm sure you've found it as well, Torsten, they've gone a little bit off the beaten track with their travel and found this kind of, I was talking about it before, this kind of authenticity, something about a place where it isn't seen through the sort of prism of tourism, and have really enjoyed it. And have really enjoyed, it might be a bit selfish and a kind of exclusivity, but enjoyed being the only kind of tourist around and being a bit special in that way. And I think that's the majority. And it's not about risk. There is definitely and it's a bit old fashioned to say, but people like a bit of an adventure. And if you're going to go on a trip with us, there's always a chance that something's going to change slightly. We might not be able to do this that day, or something might happen. There might be something really cool, like a festival or a marriage or a wedding or a funeral or something that one of our friends is involved in that we can go and see. So the trips are, we have an itinerary for them, but if there's something small happening that we can change, that's great. And honestly, the trips that people have enjoyed the most have often been the ones where it's not gone to plan, but we've managed to kind of change it and come up with something and alter it, and they've left and been like, I've just had like 10 days and this has been like, it's been an adventure. And like I think in Europe and the US, so much kind of risk is mitigated, so much things have to go to plan. We have to be here at this time, you've got to make appointments, you've got to do this, everything's got to be ordered. That to go somewhere in a small group of like-minded people and have a bit of an adventure, and there'll always be a slight risk that you're not going to see what you plan to come and see. You're not quite sure exactly how it's going to go, but you've got a company behind you who is experienced in this and have seen a lot of these things, and they can anticipate things and come up with a plan B. I think that's the appeal, to be honest. But it's not about people who have been in the military. It's about fairly normal people who just like traveling to unusual places, which you can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like how you described this, and I think your heart is right there, how you describe the sense of adventure. And that is totally my experience. I've been trying to teach this to my children. I took them to 40 different countries by now. And the idea is that I really try to instill the sense of the journey is actually the destination. And you want to try to find this crossroads where you do something where you know what you're doing, but you're still exploring and you find something new in your life. And I think psychologists do a lot of research into when are we ready to explore, and that they do this with animals. And it's typically in a state when we feel like our downside is covered, and then we go out to explore, right? We try to find things that could improve our life, that maybe is better food, that is better opportunities, that in a modern life, this is where we make more money, but it's also where we see life how it really is, and it's not the streamlined set of emotions that we see, for instance, on social media, but also I think it's changed people's brains by now. Also in real life, we have this now, and I think you're absolutely right when you are somewhere where you're the only tourist, the amount of curiosity that you have, but also is reciprocated by the locals, at the amount of attention you get, it's something very special. I think this is, if you never had this experience, if you can do one thing life-changing, then this is one that would definitely be high on my list. And it usually means you have to go pretty far in places you really are comfortable with in the first place. My first stop would be Bangladesh. It isn't a dangerous country, but it's still quite different, and it isn't well traveled, especially if you go outside of the cities. It does have some terrorist problems, but I don't think they're as widespread from what I know. So I did have this also, and it's always easier to say, I don't know, when we ask our grandparents, they would probably say the old times were always better. But I do remember it was relatively easy to go to Thailand 25, 30 years ago when I was really young. And there was literally just a few huts, a bunch of cool people with a good community, like in the movie, The Beach. And they were on the beach in Koh Phi Phi, and there were like the two places to eat, and that was it, and only clear water. And I went back 20 years ago and it was all speedboats and streamlined, right? Everything was streamlined. There were luxury hotels. There were chain hotels and chain restaurants. So things have really, the progress that we made, and I think this is the difficulty in human development, we make this progress, but it makes the individual maybe worse off. It's harder to get to those experiences that make you self-confident, right? That where you show yourself, yes, you can do it, and you can kind of conquer the world. Those experiences are pretty rare now. I think this was different 100 years ago or 200 years ago when people went to Africa and literally, just had to deal with malaria, and just there were not even a map around for most places.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, and we both are on. It's like a Facebook group it's called like the Hippie Trail. So it's got all the people that were traveled across Iran, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India to Nepal, 60s, 70s. I know a few of these, I've met a few of these characters on the way, used to, whatever, be gem dealers out of Kabul or smuggle hashish or all of these kind of things. And there's a lot of this talk. It's like, oh yeah, I feel bad for like people today. They don't have the opportunity. It wasn't like it was in our day when, there's not so much a journey of discovery, but I think every generation just has its own type of discovery. You of course you can look on Google Maps, you can find kind of every village and all of these kind of stuff, but you can still go out. There's still some amazing places in the world to go and visit and find yourself alone in. And but it's about it's about searching for that, though. It shouldn't be easy. It shouldn't be an easy thing to take that kind of path, to take something into the unknown. I mean, the trip to Thailand now is a bit like, when I went to Thailand in 1998, so similar time to when you're talking about, and it was an adventure. I didn't really know anything. I didn't bring a guidebook or anything. I really had no idea what we were doing, even though there was like Lonely Planets and all these kind of like information about places. But nowadays that's like, going to Spain for someone in Europe, or going to, Cancun or something for someone from the US. But there are still parts of the world that are less visited, and you can, get off the beaten path and have adventures. But you've just got to make an effort. And I think it was the same whether it was in the 60s, or the same whether it was in the 19th century, or the same now. If you make an effort, you can find some really interesting stuff and really push yourself and really, find more out about yourself and about the world.
Talking about making an effort, I saw your video presentation that you did about your relatively recent trip to, I think it was Puntland.
Yeah.
And from what I know, Somalia itself has kind of split up into 3 different regions, more or less recognized by different countries and by the UN. Maybe you can help us understand a little more, how does this work, and working your way into Somalia and finding a way how to deal with the perceived danger, and then recognizing and finding the real beauty of it.
So Somalia and is quite fragmented, and depending on like most of these things, it depends on your perspective. The main sort of breakaway is Somaliland, which used to be British. It used to be a British colony, whereas the rest of Somalia used to be an Italian colony. And Somaliland isn't recognized by the UN. It's not recognized by. It's recognized by almost nobody. But it is effectively independent. It has its own currency, it has its own government, it has its own military. It is effectively an independent country. But it's a funny place. I mean, if you take off from Somaliland and fly to Somalia, to fly to Mogadishu, you take off and it's a international flight, and you land, and the people in Somalia call it a domestic flight because they still claim Somaliland as part of Somalia. So it's very much dependent on your perspective. And Puntland, so Somaliland, it wants independence. That's quite clear. Puntland, which is on the tip of the Horn of Africa, they want a kind of federal state. So they don't want complete independence, but they want a federal system. Whereas the government in Mogadishu, which is the main part of Somalia, they want it to be kind of, what Mogadishu sort of ruling over. And because the country is so weak, Mogadishu has no power to tell Puntland really what it wants to do. So it's kind of quasi-independent. But to organize, and again, how to find reliable people in different parts of the world, there's all sorts of ways to do it. So as I talked about before, working in the, conflict journalists sometimes, people in the development world sometimes. As it was in Puntland, people that work in oil exploration, people need guys who are reliable, who can organize stuff, who have access to security reports, things like that. I've worked with really remote areas, the people that put in mobile phone antennas, because as you know, there's mobile phone antennas in all over the world. In the most remote parts of the world that you can imagine, there's only a few small villages, there's a mobile phone. Someone's put that up, someone relatively skilled, perhaps speaks English, works for a big organization, has probably some kind of security information about what's going on in that area. So there's all sorts of ways to kind of build up a picture of what's going on. But the trip to Puntland, when you're talking about adventure, how do you go somewhere, there's no blanks on the map anymore. How do you go somewhere that's interesting? And sometimes, it's a case of, with the talk on Puntland, I had spoken to a guy years and years ago who was in the Merchant Navy, and he told me there was this lighthouse on the very tip of the Horn of Africa, which apparently was the worst posting in the British Empire, and people would be dropped off there for, I think, 2 years at a time to serve at this lighthouse. And it was basically inland from it, there were sort of wild tribes and all these things. They had food dropped off every 6 months, and that was like considered to be the worst posting. The story was completely untrue, I later found, but it intrigued me. It was like, what is this lighthouse? And I think years later I found it on Google Earth. I could see the shadow of it. And then when I had some guests who had traveled with us to Mogadishu and had traveled to us to Somaliland and said, where else can we go in Somalia? Can we go to Puntland? That's another kind of region. I got in contact with the guys that I'd made some connections there, and then mentioned the lighthouse, and that's how that kind of trip happened. So yeah, it's just trying to, and it's again, it's an adventure. It's a story that, although it wasn't true, yeah, it's exciting. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, a bit of a finding being told about a treasure map or something like that and having to find it. And it feels like in the modern world, everywhere on the map is kind of covered, and there's cameras and there's information and all of that kind of stuff. But, you know, this is an area of the world that even sort of only a couple of years before we went there, you know, there were huge oil tankers were taken by pirates and grounded, and nobody could do anything about it. So, I mean, there are parts of the world that are hard to reach, and yeah, there's always a bit of an adventure there, I guess.
Oh, I can imagine. That's I think one of the ultimate journeys, as long as we are not able to go to Mars. So I think Elon Musk is working hard on that, so we can discover some more maps. And it's deep in our brain to explore and find. They like I said earlier, they did these experiments with cats, and they even had cats that were partially injured brain, and they would explore even more. So making maps of your territory around you that provides opportunities is an extremely deep desire that I think all mammals and even probably all animals have. And I think we're struggling more to find this in the real world, but there's obviously the digital world, the cloud world, where there's a lot of this going on right now. This is where the kids are really drawn to because it's easily accessible. But in the real world, we kind of have run out of places to do this. One other place, I don't know if you guys travel there or if you have done a trip there personally, that's really mesmerizing to me is the Amazon, because this huge forest that takes up probably 60-70% of Colombia, the same amount of Brazil's land mass. And I went to Manaus in the middle of it, which is kind of an industrial city, and they take you out to an Indian village, and you can. It's kind of it's quite amazing to see people who could still live like in the Stone Age, and 5 miles away, there's a big Nokia factory and an iPhone and an Apple factory where you make high tech. I found this really strong contrast, but it is just like say a 20-30 mile radius around that city that's easily easy to explore. But there's this massive rest of the Amazon that seems to get no coverage. I don't see a lot of tours. I don't see anyone really making that trip. Maybe I'm just missing that part of the information.
I mean, look, South America is not my area of expertise, but I mean, I know for a fact because I've been to Bolivia. I mean, there's tourism within Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Brazil that visit parts of the Amazon, but it's, I guess, like saying, yeah, there are trips that go to the Antarctic. I mean, people go to like half a dozen places within it, but then there's this vast expanses where nobody has set foot ever. And I guess the Amazon is a similar kind of situation. Yeah, you can go so far and then, yeah, you can keep going, but it kind of looks the same. I mean, it's
tough to land, right? It's literally tough to land. So you only have the rivers. They work like roads, and that is only the Amazon, the biggest one. But it splits up, so there's a bunch of different sub rivers you can go on.
Yeah.
But otherwise you have to like paraglide into this place. There's no easy way to land. There is not even for a helicopter. You have to rappel down maybe from a helicopter. So, and then, as you say, there's only more trees. So, or maybe there isn't. Or maybe there's amazing animals. Maybe there's amazing Indian villages that nobody really knows of. I'm just, whenever I go to Colombia or Brazil, I see like 90% of their country is actually the Amazon, but it's almost completely unexplored, and nobody really worries about that. Maybe because there's nothing there, could be, or maybe people have made these expeditions and haven't found much.
Well, I think there's loads of stuff there, but there is a feeling, I think, that because there are things like Google Maps and street, it feels like the whole of the world has been sort of documented, but that's just not really the case. There are effective blanks on the map. There are, like, what is under that canopy in most of the Amazon? I don't know, and I mean, how would anyone know? I mean, I'm not saying there's a whole hidden civilization there, but I think they're finding, like small, like insects and small different species every now and again in the Amazon. I think because it is vast, and there will be small, not exactly microclimates, but micro areas which certain animals are going to live. So I think. But what are you going to do there? I mean, people do expeditions exactly like you say down the rivers, but once what are you going to do once you go through? And trekking in the jungle is pretty. I mean, it's interesting because there's loads of animals and plants and all of that stuff to eat, but it's pretty grim. I mean, there's all the insects. You sweat. There's not that, there's no vistas or anything like that. I mean, trekking through the jungle is, after a couple of days, it's kind of like you've had enough.
Yeah, I've done it in Malaysia and had so many leeches all over me, and it took me hours to just fight the leeches off, and I was worried about infections, obviously, and the insects would kill me, and I didn't even know if I put sunscreen on, if I should, because you have a lot of sun for an hour and then you have none for like 2 days. So it's very unpredictable, and I was just thinking of Jared Diamond, who went through all of Papua New Guinea, it seems, and wrote this book about guns, germs, and steel, which kind of he learned so much about bird species initially, but also about the people of Papua New Guinea, and then wrote a whole. And he's a very smart person. He wrote a whole book how the civilizations developed and why they developed the way they did. And I thought that was really interesting, the way he tried to reason. From this observation going through the jungle for 20 years in Papua New Guinea. That's seemingly most of the time what he spent there. He was looking for new species. Looking for new places, what is on your list? Places you haven't been and you really want to see, but you feel like they're either too difficult right now, or you probably didn't have the time for it. But what is like the ultimate challenge when you've been to so many really dangerous places, at least in other people's perception?
As a challenge, I mean, there's always. Do I have like a sort of challenge at the moment?
Some people get into mountaineering, right? So, and then they go from one mountain that's a little difficult into all the 8,000 meters, and then they go into the one that it's possible to climb from the north side, so to speak. So there seems to be always one more challenge left.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we do is, I mean, I don't see my challenges as being like, oh, I need to organize a trip to this region or this country. Look, I'd love to be organizing trips to go back to the minaret of Jam in central Afghanistan, for example. I would love to organize trips that go to parts of Baluchistan, which is this westernmost province of Pakistan. I would love to guide in parts of Yemen that we can't reach. There's loads of places that I'd love to be guiding, but at the moment, we've looked at it, we've made the assessment, and we're not going to. I mean, look, if someone chucked enough money at us, we could hire enough security, and I'm sure we could arrange it, but not in the way that we like to work. So it's not like I want to do this, but I don't know how to do it. I mean, for me, in the last few years, I mean, I touched on it before. We've helped organize this. I'm one of the founders of the Marathon of Afghanistan, which is like, the only mixed gender sporting event in Afghanistan. The same, I've helped organise a race in Somaliland, and I sit on a couple of boards of trustees of non-profits, one from the States and one from America, that work with sport in Afghanistan. And I think that that's something that once we're reasonably established, it's a case of, okay, what, because I've always felt, and we've always felt that a trip of Untamed Borders is only successful if the guests have a good time, but also there's some benefit to the places that we guide in. We're guiding in some of the least developed, sort of traumatized regions in the world at times. So just to go there, take a group around, pay the staff that we work with, and then leave, just doesn't quite feel enough to me. We should be, if people are coming, and people who come with us usually want to feel like they've had a positive impact. So I think that's more important to me now, is as we guide, as we do trips, as we develop in other areas, is that we somehow, contribute something that is more. I mean, I think there's positivities in bringing tourists to places anyway, especially post-conflict countries where the only international people often see are development workers and soldiers. To see tourists is a positive thing, but to perhaps to bring more and to find ways that everybody can get a little bit more out of it. I think that's what's I'm more interested in now, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was curious why you are so focused on sports events. And when I think of American sports events, it seems a very commercial affair. It's basically just about, it used to be Red Bull, and then it's Gatorade. There's a sponsor who wants to put their brand out, and nobody really, there isn't a sense of community in as much as I would hope. Let's put it this way. When I participated in these events, so I live here in San Francisco, we have a lot of marathons and triathlons. And usually I just go down and talk to athletes just to find out, what is kind of their next challenge, and just to create a conversation. I find this a difficult pitch for myself. I don't see, how do I say that, the explorer spirit in most athletes, amateur athletes. So they are not professional athletes. Right there, and from a random selection, right? We basically just chat people up because it's a great place to be. It's a great atmosphere we feel in the aggregate. Why do you think sports events is what the vehicle you've chosen? Why is it not entrepreneurship? Why is it not another nonprofit?
I think if I'm perfectly honest, it chose me rather than I chose it. I mean, I like to do, I played sort of football, soccer, and rugby and cricket as a kid. So I quite like sports. I think somehow as well. I mean, if we fell into this because there was a Swiss guy put on a ski event in Afghanistan. When we started doing our ski trips to Afghanistan, he helped organize something called the Afghan Ski Challenge, and as far as tourism is concerned, people I think there's a growing increase that I think we said people want to get perhaps a bit more out of their trips rather than just going, okay, I'm going to spend 2 weeks visiting Morocco. I'm going to spend 2 weeks visiting Morocco, and a week of that I'm going to do like a painting course or a sketching course with someone. I'm going to, something that I'd like to do, and I like to travel, to combine the two. And I think there's an increase in people, like as you said, most people who go running and do a 10K run or a marathon, they're not always interested in travel. But if you're interested in travel and you're interested in running, what better way to have a trip that includes a race? You go to Myanmar and do the Bagan marathon around all the pagodas and have a way to meet lots of new people, both Burmese and international. I mean, it's a great combo. So from a commercial idea, it made sense. And then, as you say, it's like, oh, it's a race. There's a big banner with like Gatorade or whoever sponsoring it. And I'm like, well, yeah, the same reason that I organize tourism in Afghanistan. I'm not a development organization. So we're like, if there's going to be a race, this isn't it should be commercially viable, it shouldn't be like a charity organization. So we have a telecommunications company sponsors it. The international people that run give an entrance fee. It is free for the Afghan runners, and we do sometimes do like other kind of little fundraising things to increase the numbers of people. But it can function. The core of it functions in the same way as a race would function in the US or the UK. There's a sponsor, there's entrance fees, and that covers the majority of the basic costs. And I think that's really important in somewhere like Afghanistan. Why should there not be something like that? That just there should be no other reason there, but nobody's done it. So I'm like, well, let's do it. And I think that's the benefit of some of these things. And in Somaliland, I mean, we've seen it. We've seen other races link with other sponsors and say, why are you doing that? We're going to do that. And I don't think I'm possibly not going to be involved in the Somaliland anymore, because they're like, we don't need these guys coming out. It's not that nobody could link the sponsors and the sports together. It's just that there wasn't this kind of trust that it would work and it would get the exposure and all of that kind of things. And if we just kind of put it together, and it's like I said with this entrepreneur and the guys with the paninis in Afghanistan. It's not like anything new, but it's just bringing something new in a place where it's not been seen before, and it's just a really positive thing. So it's not that I think I've sat down and researched for 3 months what is the best vehicle that I can bring social change to Afghanistan. I kind of fell into it, but I have this thing in life. If someone you see something or someone asks you and there's no good reason for you not to do it, then the only option left is to do it. And that was the same with the marathon. Someone was talking about it. This other guy called James, who's from the UK, who puts on marathons, was keen to get involved. And so I had to get involved at that point because I could see all the steps to make it work. And it's like, in the 5 or 6 years we've been doing it, it's not just about us, but, in Bamiyan where we run it, when I went there 10 years ago, there were no women doing sports. Now, in the morning, there will be a group of girls going running and nobody will bat an eyelid that they're running. In somewhere like Afghanistan, that's an incredible change. And it's not that race is the only thing, but it's part of a bit of a movement towards that kind of social change, which I think is, it's nice to be involved in it.
It's a bit like life is choosing us. We don't really choose life. I was just talking to Nick Lockway yesterday, and we've been contemplating about free will. And there is a real debate in there how we use our own skills, right? And the way they've been by accident probably equipped with things. And then we take it out to the world, and then the world kind of chooses us, right? And like almost from kindergarten or maybe even earlier, because there's certain things we're good at, and then other things we are not good at. But to us, it feels like we went into these things because we wanted to. But very often it's no. I mean, it's the opposite, right? So other people around us chose us because we had the best member community to do this with the right set of skills. And then afterwards, we found an explanation to tell us, okay, well, that's what most people do, right? I always wanted this, but actually, you didn't even know that 50 months ago, 50 years ago, whenever that decision actually happened. So that's really something that throws you off pretty quickly in life. When I go to countries, and that might reflect my own personal makeup, or maybe it's much more common because I see this in other people too, is you immediately think of how can I make this place better, right? So from an entrepreneurial perspective, from certainly also from a governmental perspective, the first thing I do, and it never ends, is always keeping going on while I'm in that place. And most people don't listen to this. Nobody wants to hear about this. But I always feel like there would be so many things that are cheaper, easier, better, right? To build a country that is more developed. Very often, this is a foreign view, right? Because for people who live in that country, the situation often presents itself quite differently. There's other challenges. They might have different priorities. And in general, I always say we have the government we deserve. over long term, not short term. We don't deserve, nobody deserves a war, but long term, I think we all get it sooner or later. And that's also true for our environment. It's designed by us, and it's not true for 10 years, but it reflects a long term view of the population. Do you share that too? When you go to other countries, you immediately start thinking, how can I help? But not in the sense of want to donate money, but how could I contribute to make this place better in all kinds of abilities? And that's what kind of led to your involvement in the end.
I don't think so. I mean, I think whether that means I'm less altruistic or I'm less of an entrepreneur, but usually when I'm visiting somewhere, I think I'm always thinking of if it's somewhere new, I'm kind of not exactly focusing, but almost like enjoying being in that moment and just trying to just relaxing into it. And if I'm planning anything, of course I'm planning something commercially of how I would kind of package this experience and describe it as well. A bit, I mean, potentially as a more in a kind of writer's eye or retelling, or how would I describe this? How would I, if I find out something about how the economy works or how the geopolitics is working there and how these two political guys and who's done, like that sort of stuff I enjoy finding out about. And it's more, and making connections and contacts and how just collecting. It's more of like it's just a collection of information. That's how I'm doing it. It's not what am I going to do with it right now, but how I'm just collecting all this information. And I know because I'm going to be working there I'm probably going to be working there. Where can that slot in? Where can that slot in the bigger picture of Untamed Borders, in the bigger picture of me, in the bigger picture of organizations that I'm working in? It's not necessary because I'm not really I'm not a fixer, as in I'm going to come in and this is the plan. I'm more of a connector, and I can connect the people that want to travel, different organizations, journalists, connecting people together, being the glue between different kind of bits of, different people and different things. So I think it's just if I'm going somewhere new, it's extremely open to what people are saying, what I'm seeing, what's available, what potential it could have, rather than, and then, it's more that's what I'm doing.
Would you describe yourself as a polyglot in that sense? Do you have like lots? Do you speak like 20 different languages?
No, I speak English, and I kind of can speak Dutch, but I'm not. I mean, I probably not started, but I can probably ask for directions or some food in maybe about 10 languages or something. But that's just, but not. I can't speak it.
Yeah,
but I like to. I mean, I like to collect information for sure.
So I didn't grow up in the US. So I struggled with other languages before. English was my fourth language, and obviously it's the one I use the most now. So that it turns out is a bit of an advantage, because at least when you travel, it probably makes it a little easier to get this concept of other languages. You definitely have that, right? But if you don't travel that much, it's hard to get there. And one thing that I noticed, and I don't know if you ever came across someone who did that, I feel there is a limit of how many languages you can fluently, like you can have a good conversation on pretty much any topic, not philosophical, but somewhat complicated. I feel there's a limit on how many languages you can do this. So I can do it probably in 3 or 4 languages, but I definitely can't do it. And I know words in lots of other languages, but only know like, I don't know, 20 words, maybe 30 words. I don't know if you ever came across someone who did this in 15 languages. Is that even possible? I was always curious.
I mean, I know that, I think, and this reflects a lot on just human nature anyway. we have a huge capacity for doing all sorts of things, but in what situation would you speak? Would you need to speak 15 languages? I guess is the question. Now, look, my partner in Pakistan, Kausar, he speaks 8 languages, but it's not 8 languages as he's really ever gone out to learn any of them, because he lives in Pakistan. So in Pakistan, the national language is Urdu, but Urdu is only spoken as the mother tongue by about 10% of the population. So he speaks Urdu, but he speaks Pashto because he's Pashtun. But the biggest language spoken in Pakistan is Punjabi. So he speaks Punjabi as well. But in the old city of Peshawar where he lives, they speak Kawa, which is the original language of there before the Pashtuns. And because of all the Bollywood films, he speaks Hindi as well. Now, he's not actually from Pakistan, he's from Afghanistan. So he speaks Farsi, he speaks Persian, and he speaks Dari as well, which are quite related, but they are different languages. And also he speaks English because he guides. Now, these 8 languages are kind of his daily languages, potentially his daily languages. He could speak all of those languages in a day in Peshawar. Now, that's without him really having, if he grew up like that and decided to learn another 4 languages because of school and going to China or going to France or something like that, there's a possibility. But at what point can you actually, like, that's quite a specific case. And but at what point are you going to have 15 languages without and realistically be speaking them every day? Do you know what I mean? Like, what crazy combination of geopolitical,
you got to be a trader. You know, I was talking to Mark Sarafim, and he grew up in Beirut or in Lebanon, and he said, you know, the Lebanese figured out pretty early in their life as Phoenicians, that before Lebanon even existed, that they're just too small, and they were always behind the Hebrews anyways, the Israelites. So they weren't the smartest around, and they were never the biggest country, so to speak. But what they could really figure out, how they could learn everyone's language, give them a good time when they come to Lebanon, and trade with them, go to those countries. And you know, as in that situation, as more languages you speak, you make more money, right? So obviously your children have to learn it, and it's not arbitrary. But I can easily see that someone goes scale this up and says 15, 20 languages. For some people, comes much easier than others. It's not that easy to me either. I have to really put effort in. But some people listen to words, see it once, and that's it, right? They can use it after that. So I was always fascinated by that ability, because I feel, I'm not sure this is actually true, but I feel every language, you think differently, and it opens a new world to you. Like you said earlier, you know, we need to go out and have that adventure and discover something for ourselves. That is the case in the trips that people do with you. It also can be a new experience that opens up a new world if you learn a completely new language, because people think slightly different. The structure of thoughts are different, and you can learn. So I learned Russian and then read Dostoevsky, and those are complicated in any language, but it gives you another portal you can go through, and then you're through, and then you know it, right? And then you're like, okay, I need to go on to the next one. But it's never over, and I don't think there's a holy grail. But I feel like if you are able to accumulate so many languages, maybe you can also accumulate so many cultures. You can accumulate so many different ways of thinking. But that's all just a speculation. To be honest, I'm still looking, right? So that's part of why I'm doing this podcast, to learn more about people who have that gift. I don't have it.
I think, and look, I think there is. I agree with you about the different cultures, because one of the things that I think we also are a little bit sort of cultural translators. So when people go to the countries that we guide in, I always say we try and guide by giving people a framework around what they're seeing. Like, it's very easy just to go somewhere and say, oh, that's what I'm seeing is a I don't know, like a woman in a burqa. So I'm seeing a woman who's got a big blue sheet over her head and looks like a shuttlecock. Well, therefore she's oppressed, and probably the men are bastards. And that's reasonable to see that from that image. But of course, I think you touched on it before with Papua New Guinea. Tribal societies, we all developed, or every society developed from tribal societies. They were the earliest societies that we had as human before, going into sort of larger civilizations. And any tribal societies has all sort of not complicated rules, but has rules about different kind of things. And this is where it all comes from. And they can still make a judgment and say that but you have to create a sort of framework for that. So I see partly that we understand and somehow speak the language, I guess, of some of the cultures that we work in. And I see that sometimes in, the language sometimes in the same way that like you would sometimes think in Russian or think in Swedish, or you're originally Swedish, right? Or German.
Yeah.
Or think in German. Sometimes someone will ask me something, whether we can do something in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and I know the answer is no, but I have to work out why it's no. Like, I know why this is going to be a problem, but I have to work out how I'm going to explain it to them, because that this is going to cause a problem for a security reason, for a cultural reason, whatever. But it's quite hard. I have to take a couple of steps back, and how I'm going to explain that is like not appropriate, or it's going to be an issue, or any of those kind of things. So yeah, there is a kind of I guess a cultural language that you learn. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think I don't know if you listened to Alexander Bart. I just listened to him a couple of weeks ago, and he has this picture of shamanism. So he in his mind, and he's a philosopher. He's very well known in Europe. About 4 to 5% of a population has shamans. He calls them shamans, and those are people who travel between. They're in between other people, and they speak the different languages, not just culturally, but also in terms of different meanings. And they are the ones who are typically trusted within that population. So 95% of the population has no idea, no interest in it. But then there's 5%, and that seems to be stable across any time frame, across any population. And those are the people who want to be the translators. Not literally necessarily, but they want to go out, like you just said, you have to find how to make this cultural translation work. Those are the people who would be drawn to this. So and feel they hear this calling. And they are also the people who are very often religious. They don't have to be, right? But they're often priests, and they are working with religion on a daily basis. But it's probably my last question. What is your discovery, your religious discovery? I don't know how you grew up. Maybe you can help us understand better. But seeing places that are dominated probably by a different religion, how does this help to reflect on your own religion, or maybe change your religion, become more or less religious?
I mean, I didn't have. I mean, I was christened, but I mean, I didn't have a particularly strong religious upbringing, and I would say that from time spent certainly initially when I first sort of traveled sort of independently myself in the Middle East and in Islamic countries, I learned more about Christianity than I did that I think I knew before, because to understand Islam, obviously you have to understand Judaism and Christianity. It's the Abrahamic religion is the same. But not the same, but it's the same root. It's the same stories.
They reference each other. Yeah.
They reference each other. In the Middle East, people live next door to each other. They know these religions are so heavily intertwined, and spent time in Syrian Orthodox monastery in just north of Damascus for a week. Maybe this is 14 years ago now, which was very interesting. But I think that I don't think it's ever really changed my sort of views on religion. I see that a huge amount of sort of strength and unity and power positive power in religion. I think anyone that says, all the wars and the, things like this are caused by religion. I mean, wars are caused by people and power and all of these kind of things. And you can put religion in front of it, or you can put nationalism in front of it, or you can put whatever you want in front of it. It's about power and ways of coercing people to come together and fighting for defense and fighting all sorts of other reasons, but resources and religion is you can put in front of it. But I don't know. It's a strange question. I don't know if there's any kind of there's nothing hugely profound, except, I mean, what I would say is that it's not necessarily a religious thing, but in a lot of the places that I work, I think and when do you ever really understand something? But a thought that always helped me or helps me understand places is that in Europe and in North America there is this the idea of, how can I say it? The idea of being, what's the word? Independent. No, being so the idea of personal freedom. That's it. The idea of personal freedom is extremely powerful. We grew up with these kind of Hollywood films in that the teenage hero doesn't listen to his parents and whatever, and he turns out to be right. And the idea that your personal freedom is incredibly important. And in a way, there's a huge amount of judgment on other cultures where the family and the community are really important. And that if people are pressured the people are pressured by that family and pressured by that community to conform. And that's just wrong. That's a wrong thing to do. Whereas I find that in a lot of the places that I work, people like the idea of a bit of personal freedom. Like, who doesn't like a bit of idea of personal freedom? But also the commitment to the family and the community and the religion is also really important. It's not like a burden. It's not like something that everyone just wants to break the shackles of and go away. People really find that an important thing as well. And I think that's something, it's slightly off the topic, but I think that's something that to possibly to understand that helps a lot in understanding the cultures of a lot of the places that I work in, if that makes any sense.
That makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you perfectly. The view and the risk of the view that we have as the most developed place, right, so to speak, is that we take our verbatim views that are very new, right? So the independence revolution, as you would probably call it, that's only since the 60s. Maybe you can trace it back to the 30s, but it's a relatively new thing, and nobody knows if this is actually going to survive. This is like communism was 100 years ago. It looked like a beautiful idea, but nobody was really sure if this is going to survive, and it kind of didn't develop the best track record, let's put it this way. It's still out there and might still make a comeback. And the same is true with this hardcore individualism that is so far away that, and I think Muslims see this better than Christians, because and I think Muslims and Israelites or Hebrews, Jews see this much stronger than Christians see this. As further we go away from the ways of the Old Testament, we increase risk. That doesn't mean we're wrong, but it probably means we're adding risk. So it's not like we make it seem, and how Hollywood and modern media makes it sound to us, that we know the truth, right? So there's like Barack Obama's famous saying, you want to be on the right side of history. He's correct, but he obviously implies that he already knows the right side of history, which is godlike, right? So, which is ridiculous when you think of it. But it's something that's being used all the time in modern media, and to fend off any kind of conservatism. And I think this is odd. There is a middle ground, and it is for people in the end to decide. And more importantly, it is to decide for how much we're going to advance. So these religious rules are basically survival rules. I always call it the Bear Grylls handbook of philosophy. So they are given to us because they helped our ancestors to survive better, to create better products, to create all of the stuff and technology that we see around us. And that's definitely not the last word. So there's a lot of things that we should reconsider. But I'd say 90% of it is pretty spot on. It's pretty correct. But this is not the modern view. And I think this is really puts people at odds going to places that are more conservative. And it makes it hard to like have an open mind. People develop this, and I think traveling to a lot of places and also spending time and effort into this definitely does that for you, right? And I think you already went through this process, like all of us who've done this for a while. You open up your mind and you see, okay, there's other worlds out there. It's not just what I was told when I was young. Maybe that wasn't true, but maybe there was only 10% of the truth. But maybe it was 100%, but I didn't reflect it correctly when I learned it. So those are things you learn necessarily when you go to places that are outside of your comfort zone. And I do feel that the current view of Islam is really, is judged from a Western world, is really interesting. So we don't have time for this. I would love to talk a little more about this. Maybe if you can come back on the show, and if you want to talk about that, because it is a sensitive topic. But there is a lot of different things that are going on with the view of Islam that I think are not actually what's going on when you see Islam in action. So it is, on one hand, is more conservative than people think, but on one hand, it's more strict. But on the other hand, it's also not. It is much more open. And I'd love to dive a little deeper into this.
No, I mean, again, it's such a wide-ranging to say, to sort of couch Islam as and the Islamic world as a billion people and in with one voice is
sure.
Of
but
course,
it is more. It seems to be more orthodox than, say, Christianity and even Judaism. So while it's not fair and it's definitely a generalization, we would have to make it more specific. I fully agree. It is a little more orthodox, so there is more of an adherence to the book, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that there is, yeah, for sure. And as you said, I mean, this is another, like, you know, this is another 2 hours of discussion.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for doing this, James. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I hope we'll have you back here talking about some more topics next time. I learned a lot. I really appreciate that you took the time.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me on. It's been great. It's absolutely flown by, and I'd love to come back another time. We can find something else to have a bit of a deep dive on. So, but thank you very much. It's been great.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
James, take care. Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.